The moment she stepped inside, the heavy wooden door swung shut behind her with a soft click. The office was far more luxurious than she had expected: dark leather chairs, polished mahogany desk, and a panoramic view of the city skyline glowing under the afternoon sun. The air smelled of expensive cologne, the kind that lingered, the kind that made an impression. She clutched the envelope in her hands, reminding herself why she was there. A simple errand: drop off the files her husband had left at home. Nothing more. But as she lifted her gaze, she found him watching her, an expression of quiet amusement tugging at the corners of his lips. "Emma." His voice was smooth, deeper than she remembered from their brief interactions at company events. "I didn't expect to see you here today." She shifted on her feet, offering a polite smile as she placed the folder on his desk. "Ethan forgot these. He asked me to drop them off since he's in meetings all day." He leaned back in his chair, studying her as if she were something more interesting than the stack of documents in front of him. "That was thoughtful of you. Have a seat for a moment." There was no real reason to stay, but something in his tone made it feel less like an invitation and more like a request that wasn't meant to be refused. She hesitated, then slowly lowered herself into the chair across from him. "How's Ethan doing?" he asked, his gaze never wavering from hers. She nodded. "Busy, as always. Between work and travel, it feels like he barely has time to breathe." Something flickered in his expression, something unreadable. "That sounds about right," he mused. "He's lucky to have you, keeping things together for him." There was something in the way he said it, something that made the room feel smaller, the air warmer. His voice had softened slightly when he said "you," and she felt a strange heat rise in her chest. Her fingers tightened around the strap of her purse, trying to steady herself. "I should probably—" He stood, moving around the desk before she could finish. He wasn't in a rush, but the way he carried himself, the way his eyes remained locked onto hers, sent a pulse of awareness through her. "You don't have to rush off just yet," he said, standing close enough that she could catch the faintest trace of his cologne, "unless you want to." The implication in his words settled between them, heavy and undeniable. He wasn't touching her, hadn't done anything inappropriate, yet the air between them crackled like something waiting to ignite. Her breath caught, her heart pounded. She knew she should stand up, should leave. But she didn't. She stayed seated, looking up at him, feeling something she hadn't felt in a long time, something dangerous. The silence between them stretched, charged with something neither of them acknowledged but both could feel. Emma's pulse quickened as she tried to remind herself why she was here, just to drop off a folder, nothing more. And yet, the way he stood close, the way his gaze settled on her with quiet intensity, made the air feel thick and heavy. "Ethan's lucky," he said, his voice smooth, deliberate. "I don't think he realizes just how much." She felt her breath hitch slightly at his words. A harmless compliment, on the surface, yet the way he said it made it feel like something else entirely. She offered a polite smile, trying to steer the conversation back onto safer ground. "We both have busy schedules. It comes with the job, I suppose." "Right," he murmured, his lips curving into something that wasn't quite a smirk but wasn't entirely neutral either. "But tell me, does anyone ever stop to ask if you're happy?" The question caught her off guard, and for a moment she hesitated. It wasn't something people usually asked, not directly, not with that kind of weight behind it. She swallowed, suddenly feeling the heat of his presence in the space between them. His suit jacket was off now, draped over the chair. The crisp white shirt he wore had the sleeves rolled up to his forearms, a small but intimate detail she found herself noticing. His tie was loosened slightly, like he had settled in for a conversation he had no intention of ending too soon. She tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, an old nervous habit she hadn't even realized she was doing. She started, but her voice faltered when he reached across the desk to pick up the pen beside her. For the briefest moment, his fingers brushed against hers, The warmth of his skin a stark contrast to the cool metal of the pen. It was nothing, barely a touch, but it sent a jolt of electricity up her spine, her entire body suddenly hyper-aware of how close he was. His eyes flicked to hers, dark and unreadable. "Did you feel that?" he asked, voice barely above a whisper. Emma's heart pounded against her ribs. "I should go," she said, but even as the words left her lips, she didn't move. He exhaled, tilting his head slightly as if studying her, searching for an answer she wasn't sure she could give. "I've noticed you," he admitted, his voice quieter now, more restrained. "For a long time." She knew this was the moment where she could stop this, where she could laugh it off, brush past him, leave the office, and pretend like nothing had ever happened. But she didn't. Instead, she looked up at him, meeting his gaze with a quiet understanding neither of them needed to put into words. The air between them crackled with something unspoken, something neither of them dared to name, yet both felt down to their core. Emma could feel her heartbeat pounding against her ribs, her breath coming faster as she watched him take a slow step closer. His fingers reached up, gently brushing a loose strand of hair away from her face. The touch was barely there, but the heat from his fingertips lingered, seeping into her skin like a brand. She should have pulled away. She should have stepped back, put distance between them, reminded herself why this was wrong. But she didn't. Instead, she stood there, frozen in place, as his touch drifted downward, trailing lightly over the side of her neck, down to her wrist. His fingertips barely grazed her skin, yet the sensation sent a shiver down her spine. He could feel her pulse racing beneath his touch, the way her breath hitched as he leaned in slightly, his warm breath teasing the delicate skin of her cheek. "Tell me to stop," he murmured, his voice low, husky, full of something dark and tempting. Emma opened her mouth, but no words came. The logical part of her screamed at her to say it, to push him away, to turn and walk out of this office like nothing had ever happened. But the other part, the part that had felt neglected, unseen, untouched for so long, refused to move. Her chin tilted up slightly, her lips parting just enough for him to take it as a silent invitation. And then it happened. His lips met hers, hesitant at first, as if testing the waters, waiting for her to stop him. But she didn't. She pressed into the kiss, responding to him in a way that made it clear there was no turning back now. The restraint he had been holding on to snapped. His hands found her waist, pulling her flush against him as the kiss deepened, no longer slow or searching, but full of months, maybe even years, of unspoken desire. Her fingers curled into the fabric of his shirt, gripping him as if afraid to let go. The sound of their uneven breaths filled the office, the tension between them unraveling into something reckless, something dangerous. Every inch of space between them disappeared as his hands roamed over her back, mapping the shape of her body as if committing it to memory. For the first time in a long time, Emma felt truly seen, truly desired. A part of her knew there was no taking this back, no pretending this never happened. The line had been crossed. And yet, she couldn't bring herself to care. Not when he was holding her like this. Not when, for the first time in years, she felt truly alive. His hands gripped the edges of the desk behind her, his body close but not touching, his breath uneven. Emma felt her pulse hammering in her chest, a mix of anticipation and fear twisting inside her. Every inch of her body was screaming at her to move, to leave, to put space between them before it was too late. But she didn't. She couldn't. He reached for her slowly, as if giving her a chance to stop him, but she stayed, her breath catching when his fingers traced lightly over her arm before settling at her waist. The warmth of his touch sent a rush of something unfamiliar through her, something she hadn't felt in years. It wasn't just attraction, it was a hunger, a deep, undeniable pull. The moment their lips met again, all hesitation shattered. What started as slow and tentative quickly turned into something desperate, something raw. His hands moved over her back, pulling her closer until there was no space left between them. The feeling of being wanted, of being completely seen, overtook every rational thought. The weight of what this meant, the risk, the consequences, none of it mattered in that moment. Her fingers gripped the front of his shirt, pulling him even closer as he deepened the kiss, his touch igniting something reckless inside her. Every part of her that had been numb, every part that had been yearning for something more, was suddenly awake, alive. She knew she should stop, knew she was standing on the edge of something dangerous, but she had already crossed the line, and she wasn't sure she wanted to go back. The way he touched her, the way he whispered her name against her skin, made the reality of the world outside this office fade. The only thing that existed was this moment, this need, this feeling of being consumed by something neither of them could control. It was intoxicating, terrifying, and completely irresistible. For a moment they pulled apart, their breathing heavy, their eyes locked in silent understanding. This wasn't just a mistake. This wasn't just a lapse in judgment. This was something they had both wanted for longer than either of them would admit. His thumb brushed over her lower lip, his touch softer now, his gaze searching hers as if asking if she was sure, if she was ready for where this was leading. And instead of answering, she pulled him back to her, closing the distance once more. She didn't want to think about tomorrow. She didn't want to think about what this meant. She just wanted to feel something real, something that made her forget everything else, even if it was only for tonight. The silence in the office was deafening. Heavy breaths slowed, the heat of the moment fading into something colder, something neither of them were prepared to face. Emma's fingers trembled slightly as she smoothed down her blouse, attempting to regain some sense of composure. She could still feel the warmth of his hands on her skin, the way his lips had lingered just a moment too long. The room, once a space filled with tension and desire, now felt suffocating under the weight of reality. She took a step back, creating space between them, but the air still felt charged, as if the echoes of what had just happened refused to leave. He ran a hand through his hair, exhaling deeply, his shirt slightly wrinkled from where she had gripped him. Neither of them spoke, but the gravity of what they had done hung between them, impossible to ignore. Emma's thoughts raced, crashing into one another with dizzying force. Her husband, her marriage, the life she had promised herself she would protect. The guilt seeped in slowly at first, like a whisper in the back of her mind, but it grew louder with every passing second. What had she done? How had she let it go this far? He finally spoke, his voice quieter than before. We shouldn't have. He didn't finish the sentence, as if even saying the words out loud would make it too real. She nodded, swallowing hard. I know. But even as the agreement settled between them, neither of them moved. The pull that had drawn them together still lingered, an invisible force neither could deny. His eyes flickered to hers, searching, as if trying to gauge what she was thinking. Was she regretting it? Did she wish it had never happened? Or was she just as torn as he was? I should go, she whispered, more to herself than to him. She reached for her bag, her hands unsteady as she adjusted the strap over her shoulder. The quicker she left, the sooner she could convince herself this was a mistake, a lapse in judgment, a moment she could bury deep inside and never think about again. But as she turned to leave, his hand caught her wrist, his touch light but firm. A final hesitation. A final moment where neither of them wanted to say goodbye. Her breath hitched and she hated the way her body responded, the way she felt that same rush of heat just from his fingers against her skin. She forced herself to pull away, stepping toward the door with her head down, unable to look at him any longer. She knew if she did, she might stay. She might not be strong enough to walk away twice. Without another word, she opened the door and stepped out, leaving behind the office, the moment, and the part of herself that had given in to something she was never supposed to want. The drive home was painfully silent. the hum of the engine the only sound breaking through the whirlwind of thoughts in her mind. Her hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles white, her pulse still unsteady from what had happened. The city lights blurred past her, but she barely saw them. Every red light, every stop sign, was a moment to breathe, deep, measured, trying to steady the storm inside her. What had she done? The question pulsed through her like a drumbeat, relentless and inescapable. The rush of the moment still lingered on her skin, the warmth of his hands, the way his breath had felt against her neck. She could still feel him, the weight of his body against hers, the way her body had responded without hesitation. And now, she was driving home to her husband. The thought made her stomach twist. How could she face him knowing what she had just done? She practiced her answers in her mind, rehearsing how she would act as if nothing had changed. Would he notice? Would he sense the shift in her? Or would he greet her the same way he always did? Distracted, preoccupied, barely looking up from his phone. As she pulled into the driveway, the house stood still and dark except for the soft glow from the living room window. She took a moment before stepping out of the car, smoothing her hands over her dress, forcing herself to breathe, to let go of whatever was written on her face. The moment she stepped inside, the scent of home wrapped around her, familiar, grounding, yet suddenly foreign. Her husband looked up from the couch, smiling. "Hey, you're back," he said, setting his phone aside. His voice was warm, welcoming, the same way it had been for years. It felt like a stab to her chest. "Yeah," she managed, her own voice softer than usual. She walked toward him, pressing a casual kiss to his cheek, hoping he wouldn't notice the way her lips trembled. "How'd it go?" he asked, stretching his arms behind his head, oblivious to the weight pressing down on her. "It was fine," she answered too quickly, forcing a smile, trying to appear normal. "Just dropped off the documents. Nothing exciting." Her heart pounded, waiting for something. Some flicker of suspicion in his eyes, some sign that he could see the guilt crawling beneath her skin. But there was nothing. He just nodded, yawning as he scrolled through his phone. Relief and shame warred inside her. He had no idea. He trusted her completely, and she had just shattered that trust in a single afternoon. As she lay in bed that night, curled up beside him, she stared at the ceiling, replaying every second of what had happened. The guilt was suffocating, but beneath it something darker stirred, an undeniable thrill, a memory she knew she could never erase. The phone buzzed on the nightstand, the glow of the screen illuminating the darkened room. She glanced at it, her heart lurching the moment she saw the name. It was him. A single message. Simple. Dangerous. "Are you thinking about it as much as I am?" A wave of heat surged through her, quickly followed by a chill of realization. She shouldn't have read it. She should delete it, pretend it never arrived. But her fingers hovered over the screen, hesitating, her pulse thrumming in her ears. Lying beside her, her husband shifted in his sleep, his steady breathing a cruel reminder of the life she was jeopardizing. The guilt clawed at her, but there, beneath it, was the undeniable pull, the temptation she had tried to push away since walking out of that office. She locked the phone, turning onto her side, squeezing her eyes shut as if that could erase the memory of his touch, his lips, the way his voice had wrapped around her like silk. But it wouldn't go away. It lingered, consuming her thoughts, making her chest tighten with something she refused to name. The next morning, she went about her routine, the weight of the unread message pressing against her mind like a secret only she could feel. Over breakfast, her husband kissed her forehead, murmuring a distracted "love you" before heading out for the day. She forced a smile, pretending everything was fine. But inside, she felt like she was standing at the edge of a cliff, staring down at the chaos she was about to invite into her life. Hours passed, and she found herself checking her phone more times than she wanted to admit. The message was still there, still waiting, still tempting. By the afternoon, She caved. Her fingers moved before she could stop them. A single reply. I shouldn't be. She stared at the words on the screen, debating whether to hit send, her rational mind screaming at her to stop. But her heart was already racing, anticipation curling around her like a drug. She pressed send. Minutes later, her phone buzzed again. But you are. A sharp breath left her lips, and she knew. This wasn't over. The lies began soon after. Small ones, easy to cover, running errands, meeting a friend, need some air. Excuses that gave her space, that allowed her to get in her car, hands trembling as she drove with no destination in mind, only the thought of him, of what had already happened, and what could happen again. She saw him again at an office event the next evening. From across the room, she felt his gaze before she even turned to look. Their eyes met, and in that instant, she knew. This wasn't something she could ignore. This wasn't something she wanted to stop. A choice had to be made. And deep down, she already knew what she was going to choose.